We'll be starting the lesson now. So the quote of the day is, "I would never die for my beliefs because I might be wrong," by Bertrand Russell. He's a famous logician. So the contents covered today will be what is philosophy, what is logic, valid arguments, and sound arguments. What is philosophy? Philosophy is the use of reason in understanding such things as the nature of the real world and existence, the use and limits of knowledge, and the principles of moral judgment. Different branches of philosophy include metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, and logic. Metaphysics is the study of the nature of reality. Cosmology is the study of the universe. It's a branch of metaphysics. A famous cosmologist you may have heard of is Stephen Hawking. Another branch is ontology, which is the study of existence and what it means to be. Epistemology is the study of the nature of knowledge. There are three branches, among others. Formal epistemology uses different reasoning methods from decision theory, not to be confused with social choice theory, logic, probability theory, and computability theory to answer questions related to epistemology. It can be applied to philosophy, computer science, economics, and statistics. Meta-epistemology is about understanding what knowledge is. Social epistemology poses questions about knowledge in social contexts. The third branch is axiology, which is the study of the nature of values. One branch is ethics. Ethics is the study of right versus wrong. The famous ethicist Descartes famously stated, "Cogito ergo sum," or "I think, therefore I am." Aesthetics is the study of beauty. Famous philosophers who study aesthetics include Plato, Kant, Nietzsche, Buddha, and Confucius. And now we're on to logic, which is the fourth branch. What is logic? Logic is the analysis and appraisal of arguments. Basically, we will be using unbiased points of views and symbolic languages to answer big questions like, is God real, or are the ways we treat animals unethical? These skills can also be applied to questions in other areas such as sports and pollution. Logic gives us analytical skills that we can apply to other studies such as law, politics, journalism, education, medicine, business, science, math, computer science, and more. Logic also helps us understand philosophy better. We hope you'll enjoy logic. Many people find logic fun because it's challenging. It encourages us to think critically in order to make the best possible decisions. So what are valid arguments? First, we have to define statements. Statements are either identified as true or false. Arguments are a set of statements consisting of premises, which are the supporting evidence, and a conclusion based on the evidence. The symbol with the three dots in the shape of a triangle before a conclusion means therefore. Arguments can be identified as valid, invalid, sound, or unsound. The premises kind of act like when you're writing an essay, and the premises would be the body paragraphs, and the conclusion would just be the conclusion paragraph. Validity. An argument is valid if it would be contradictory to have the premises all true and conclusion false. However, just because an argument is valid, that doesn't mean that all of the premises are true, just that the conclusion follows from the premises. The example to the right is valid because of its logical form. Therefore, you can rewrite this argument using words or symbols for logical notions and letters for content phrases. In this case, capital A represents oversleeping and capital B represents being late. So in the example it says, if you overslept, you'll be late. You aren't late. Therefore, you didn't oversleep. So the symbolic form would be if A, which represents oversleeping, then B, you'll be late. So not B, therefore not A. Another example of validity would be if you're in France, you're in Europe. You aren't in Europe, therefore you are not in France. The symbolic form would be if A, then B, not B, therefore not A. A represents being in France and B represents being in Europe. Another example of invalidity would be if you overslept, you'll be late. You didn't oversleep, therefore you aren't late. The symbolic form would have being A representing oversleeping and B representing being late. So it would be if A, then B, not B, therefore not A. And another example is if you're in France, you're in Europe. You aren't in France, therefore you aren't in Europe. Because you could also be in other countries such as Germany or Russia. So in this, the symbolic form, A represents being in France and B represents being in Europe. So if A then B, not A, therefore not B. It's kind of like how in programming you can have variables represent different phrases. Sound arguments. An argument is sound if it's valid and every premise is true. When we try to prove a conclusion, we try to give a sound argument with valid and true premises. Therefore, we have a sound argument and our conclusion is true. An argument can be unsound if it has one or more false premises, or if the conclusion might not follow from the premises. So an example of valid and true premises is, if you're reading this, you aren't illiterate. You're reading this, therefore you aren't illiterate. An example with the first premise being false would be, all logicians are millionaires. Gensler is a logician, therefore Gensler is a millionaire. For future reference, Gensler is a logician and philosophical professor. An example where the conclusion doesn't follow is, all millionaires eat well. Gensler eats well, therefore Gensler is a millionaire. Because anyone who can afford decent food can eat well. Criticizing an opponent's argument as unsound. Here's where logic can tie in if you're interested in debate or politics. When criticizing someone's argument, the best way to prove that it is unsound, we can either show that there is a false premise or the argument is invalid. We can also ask how certain the opponent is that a premise is true. Another way to criticize an opponent's argument is to show that at least one premise is uncertain. So an argument example is, before Barack Obama was elected US president, he was ahead in the polls, but critics thought that he would be defeated by the Bradley effect. This means that people thought that white people would say that they would vote for a Black candidate, but they wouldn't actually go through with it. So Michelle Obama's argument against the Bradley effect in the 2008 US presidential election. Barack Obama is the Democratic nominee. If there's going to be a Bradley effect, then Barack wouldn't be the nominee, because the effect would have shown up in the primaries. Therefore, there isn't going to be a Bradley effect. The first premise is undeniable. The second premise can only be disproved if we can show the Bradley effect appearing in the final election. In the end, there was no Bradley effect and Barack Obama won the presidential election. So deductive reasoning versus inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning was used by the famous philosopher Aristotle. Conclusions claim to follow with necessity. So you go from information to finding patterns, to developing a tentative hypothesis, and to concluding with a theory. And inductive reasoning conclusions claim to follow with probability. It's used by Sherlock Holmes, even though in the BBC show he claims to be using deductive reasoning, which is false. So you start with a theory, you create a hypothesis, then you make observations, and then you confirm your theory. Our arguments so far have been deductive. However, there are also inductive arguments, which are weaker and harder to prove. Inductive arguments are commonly used to create scientific theories. To the right are two different arguments. In the first one, the conclusion follows the premises, so it is impossible for all the premises to be true, but the conclusion false. The second one, the conclusion is a good guess, but it could also be false. So in the first one, it's all who live in France live in Europe. Pierre lives in France, therefore Pierre lives in Europe. That makes sense because France is part of Europe. And an inductively strong argument would be most who live in France speak French. Pierre lives in France. That's all we know about the matter. Therefore, Pierre probably speaks French. We don't know if he speaks French because maybe Pierre is the son of the Polish ambassador and speaks no French. So that's all we have for today's lesson. This week's homework, it's your turn to try to answer a philosophical question. Write a paragraph answering the question, what is beauty? And hand it in before the next class. I'll be posting the assignment on our Google Classroom later. Does anyone have any questions? I'm really excited to hear that. Yeah, logic is actually really useful in other classes too. Like when I took algebra, I was able to use it. Yeah, sure. I'll slow down. So like when I took algebra, I was able to use logic to answer some of my quiz questions. Like we'll be learning in the next lesson about the star test, which is when you can use the symbolized arguments that I showed you before and form a conclusion by deciding whether the argument is valid or invalid. And I was also able to use things I learned in my logic class when I was on my middle school debate team. Oh, that's really cool. In future lessons, we're going to be learning about fallacies, so that'll really help if you want to be a journalist, because you can examine, for example, a politician's argument and say, oh, this is wrong because he said this, which is fallacious, which means that he wrote something, but it doesn't actually make his argument valid. Yeah, I'll be posting the slides after this class along with a recording of the course. You can also try to argue against personal opinions. That's kind of how a debate works. Are there any things that we need to add into this paragraph? It's a very objective question, so just answer with what you think beauty means. Are there any other questions? What's your comment? It doesn't matter. Just write a minimum of 4 to 5 sentences. If you want, you can write as much as you want, though. It's just for fun. I want to see what you guys think of the word beauty, because a lot of words have ambiguous definitions. Logic is like the thought you remember, but not specifically, like a word on the tip of your tongue. I agree. That's what I thought when I first started logic. But once we get into symbolizing English arguments into logical formats with different types of symbols, everything will make more sense, kind of like in programming and math. Oh, and by the way, I got a lot of feedback about this course and the content covered in it. And since it's a graduate level course, I didn't want to overwhelm you guys because if I taught a graduate level course, it would stretch out a lot more into 2020. So I'll try to cut it down so that it's an undergraduate level course. Yeah, so the paragraph length is not specific. Just write as much as you want. It's going to be more than 8 weeks. I haven't finalized the total length, but I'll be providing more information once I divide all of the course material so that I can try to fit everything into 40-minute classes each week. No, they do not run the same amount because some courses like logic, they're a higher level college level course, so it'll take longer to teach. And some courses like how to draw will only take a few weeks because it's a different topic to draw each week. I'm going into 10th grade. I took logic when I was going into 8th grade the summer before because I got into a program to take undergraduate courses at Johns Hopkins. What about when school starts in September? Uh, I'll move the class to a time that fits for everyone. Hopefully we can still keep our Monday class, but we can definitely do it later. And if that doesn't work, we can switch to the weekend. Thank you, Derek. You're welcome. Does anyone have any final questions? If not, it's fine. I'll let you guys go a couple minutes early. That's cool. Thank you for coming. You're welcome. Bye. You're welcome.